What happens when your brain stops telling itself to stay awake? And what does this have to do with sleep paralysis? So today I'm going to tell you about the weird world of narcolepsy, a disorder that we know a lot about, but still don't have great treatments for. Before I go into this disorder, I would like to make it very clear that narcolepsy is not fainting goats. And I'm not trying to be snarky, this is literally just a question that my students ask me every year. Now, fainting goats, also known as Tennessee wooden leg goats, which I'm pretty sure you can't say without an accent, seriously, go ahead and try it. That is based on like a muscle stiffening problem. So basically, those goats, when excited, their muscles just like stiffen and then they fall over. So like the goats don't fall asleep, but in narcolepsy, the people are actually falling asleep. So what we commonly see is that people are basically like very tired during the day. They are way more likely to have like hallucinations that seem like vivid dreams. They have sleep paralysis, which I'll get into in a little bit later. And they also have these kind of like sudden bouts of excessive daytime sleepiness. So they will fall asleep. And when I say fall asleep, I mean like fall asleep. They are going directly into REM. Now, to understand what this means, you have to understand a little bit about the sleep stages. So REM is like the rapid eye movement stage, and it's where most of our dreams are occurring. And this is why sleep paralysis happens too. So what you see is that our brain basically turns off our body when we are dreaming. Rightfully so. We don't want to act out our dreams. So for example, I am like being murdered in my dreams every single night. I don't want to act out like fighting somebody. It could potentially harm somebody. So what happens with sleep paralysis is that basically your brain is telling your body to turn off, to be paralyzed during REM, and then it just never kind of stops that paralysis. So when you wake up, your brain should automatically turn off that GABA and glycine that's making you feel paralyzed, but in sleep paralysis, it does not. You remain paralyzed for typically just a few seconds, but sometimes minutes. And this is actually a leading theory behind alien abduction. So this idea that like people are actually just paralyzed and then they feel like a pressure on them because they're paralyzed, and they're also partially dreaming. So then they actually just basically think they're being abducted. Now, people with narcolepsy have more frequent and more intense episodes of sleep paralysis. So about 50% of people with narcolepsy have sleep paralysis compared to the 20% of people who just have it in general. So people with narcolepsy are more likely to get sleep paralysis, and they're just like falling asleep straight into REM sleep throughout the day, which is unsurprisingly a problem for day-to-day life. Like, think about how difficult it would be to just drive if you're randomly falling asleep at points. To be fair, we do see that sleep paralysis and things like sleep apnea are linked to excessive amounts of accidents, because being sleepy while driving is very problematic for driving. And we actually rely on people to self-report if they have narcolepsy to the actual driver's license bureaus, which that's like asking a lot of people. So for example, there was a time in which I was going to go on a jet boat ride, and they're like, well, people who have had some sort of back surgery should definitely not go on this ride. And I was like, I mean, I've had back surgery, but if I just don't tell them, that means I can go on this ride, right? Now, I will say that I did tell them, and I was allowed on the jet boat ride, and my back was not hurt after that any more so than it previously was. So like the good deed ended up winning at the end. But like, it feels like we're asking a bit much of people who have some sort of problem that makes it difficult for them to drive to just self-report that. I feel like there should be some sort of like medical check somewhere. And there is in other countries, just not in the US. Now, narcolepsy is one of our most well understood sleep disorders, which you think would mean that we would be able to come up with good treatments for it, but we haven't so far. So let me explain a little bit about how it works. To understand this, you have to understand like the chemicals going on in our brain during sleep and being awake as well. So I've mentioned that GABA and glycine paralyze you during REM. We also have things like adenosine, which tell you when you should feel sleepy, and that's actually what caffeine is working against. Melatonin does something similar, and then we have the histamines, which tell us when you should like be awake, which is why if you're taking an antihistamine, like an allergy pill, it makes you feel sleepy. And that's kind of what's happening with orexin too, or hypocretin. So hypocretin or orexin, that's the main chemical that's associated with narcolepsy. And what we see is there's something going on in the system that's basically causing problems in the hypocretin system. And hypocretin is telling you that you should remain awake. So it is the signaling in our brain that says, stay awake. So if you have problems with this signaling, then you're just going to randomly fall asleep and go straight into REM. Now, we're not sure if the problem is in like the receptors or the neurons. We're still trying to figure this out, but we know that it has a strong genetic component, and we know that it could be linked to things like an autoimmune disease. We're not entirely sure about the cause yet, but we're looking more into this because we actually have some really good animal models of this. So for example, Doberman pinschers, there's a recessive disorder in which Doberman pinschers basically develop narcolepsy because that recessive disease works specifically on the hypocretin receptors. So like there's an entire group of dobies out there who just fall asleep randomly, and we can use those to develop treatments for narcolepsy. So again, you'd think that like we know how it works. We have a good model for it. We'd be able to come up with treatments, but it's way harder than that. So first, it's incredibly hard to diagnose. There is a suggestion that over 50% of people who have narcolepsy are never diagnosed for it, because it looks like other sleep disorders and the symptoms are kind of stigmatized. So you have hallucinations and you have things like random attacks of falling asleep. That is something that people, especially children, are not going to want to tell people that they see. Like, hey, I'm hallucinating and also I just fall asleep. Like, that's fine, right? And our current treatments are not great. So basically we have like stimulants, so like things that we give to people with ADHD. We also have antidepressants, so things that we give to people with depression. And then we have GHB. Yeah, like that GHB, like a salt version of it. And up until recently, we only had like 5 treatments for it, and they're all kind of terrible. So they have lots of problematic side effects. So you have things like nausea and anxiety and sleepwalking, as though you didn't have enough sleep problems. And that salt version that I mentioned, yeah, it had to be taken in the middle of the night. So you had to set an alarm. You had to basically take one pill and then immediately go to bed. And then you had to wake up hours later, so set an alarm to wake up to take a second pill. Now, only recently have they made that into a 1-pill version. And they just don't work. So over 60% of the people who were taking some sort of medication for narcolepsy, they still had over 3 bouts of excessive daytime sleepiness per day. So you had those side effects for basically nothing. So we're trying to come up with new treatments, and there's this new treatment that works on histamine that might work. But what about hypocretin? So like, what about actually fixing the main problem that's causing this? They have tried. They have tried for years, and the problem that exists is our blood-brain barrier. It's great that we have a blood-brain barrier. It keeps things out of our brain that shouldn't be there, but it's also problematic if we need like chemotherapy drugs to actually work in our brain, or if we need, I don't know, a narcolepsy drug to actually work in our brain. Now, good news for once, we are in phase 3 trials of drugs that actually work on hypocretin, so we might have something coming up soon. But as of right now, we have a highly stigmatized disorder that causes long-term daily impairments that we don't have a good treatment for. So those of you out there struggling with narcolepsy, I'm sorry, it sounds genuinely exhausting, and I don't mean that in a pun way.